Welcome back to the third part in a 4-part series I'm doing looking at the Castlevania games that fall under the 8-bit category. We've got the past two done, so it's only fitting to look at the third and final Castlevania game released on the NES, that being Castlevania III Dracula's Curse. I hope you enjoy. Oh boy, have I been looking forward to this one. Castlevania III Dracula's Curse was originally released in Japan in December of 1989 and later released in Europe in December of 1992. That's some gap. As far as the story goes, this is actually a prequel to the original Castlevania and we get a decent rundown of what's going on from the title screen here. We're actually in control of Trevor Belmont for the first time. We find out that Dracula has been practicing sorcery to create a world full of evil and hatred. Dracula started taking over Europe, people tried to defend themselves but nobody survived. With the Belmont family having a history of fighting evil behind them, it only made sense for them to be summoned to rid them of Dracula's evil. With the Belmont family being as powerful as they are, it was only natural that the townspeople felt intimidated by them, but they managed to find one Belmont family member who could help, that being Trevor Belmont, the wielder of the vampire killer whip. Now that sounds great, let's check out the gameplay. The only way I could think of starting this review was by saying this game is the dog's bollocks. Now I know this is only the third game in the series, well 5th if you want to include Haunted Castle, which I don't, and Castlevania the Adventure for the Game Boy, which I will be covering shortly. It goes back to its roots here. If you like the first Castlevania then you will love this, which in a way makes it kind of difficult to do a review on, especially after just doing one on the first Castlevania. Don't worry though, there is enough added here to merit a video on its own and that's what I'm going to get into. Even though Simon Belmont and Trevor Belmont are different, Trevor plays and controls the exact same as Simon did in the previous two games on the NES. All those new sub-weapons that were in Simon's quest is gone. So it's back to the OG when it comes to sub-weapons. We once again see the likes of the stopwatch, holy cross, holy water, flying axe and the knife. The screen nuke is back as well, along with those books you can collect to throw more than one sub-weapon at a time. The difficulty has been ramped up big time in this one. I always knew this was considered tough, but I was not expecting it to be this bad. I got my arse handed to me on multiple occasions in this. I actually found myself using the sub-weapons a lot more in this and a lot more tactically compared to the previous entries. Like I said in my Castlevania 1 video, my two favourite sub-weapons were the cross and stopwatch, but I found a lot more use for the other weapons in this too, which I think is great. Now they all have a good enough excuse to be used rather than just relying on one or two like I did in the first game. I will touch on different enemy types shortly, but for now let's take a look at some of the game's new features. I said we control Trevor Belmont, but we do also have 3 new playable characters we meet on our travels in this. The first one being Sypha, who is a priestess who disguised herself as an apprentice monk and uses the power of the elements. She had been dispatched on a secret mission to infiltrate Dracula's castle, but failed when she got captured by a Cyclops and turned into stone. We also have Grant Dynasty, who is a carefree rebel and a thief from the town of Wallachia. He had been plotting to overthrow Dracula, but he and his comrades were no match for his army. Last but not least, and now probably the most loved character in the Castlevania series who makes his debut here, and that is Alucard, the son of Count Dracula. He changed his name to Alucard as a sign that he opposed his father's way of life, and infiltrated the underground of Wallachia when Dracula dispatched his armies. Each have their own characteristics, some better than others I should say, at least with my experience anyway. Sypha is a mage who can cast spells, extremely overpowered. She has 2 different attacks, one being a fire spell that has a decent range and obliterates enemies who are in front of it. She also has a homing attack when used that targets enemies on screen. Grant moves the quickest in the game but has an incredibly short range when it comes to his attacks. He can also climb onto walls, but I just could not come to grips with it at all, no pun intended. I just found it incredibly awkward to control, especially from being underneath, moving to the side, then up as you can see from the footage here. This cost me a few times. However, he does have one ability which I found the most useful, and that was how he could change direction mid-jump, which no others could do up to this point. You could say it's an absolute game changer because up to this point in previous games, all characters once committed to a jump, that's it. You better hope for the best. This made some sections a bit easier being able to adjust before committing to a jump. Alucard's attack is projectiles. He starts off with one, but much like Trevor, by collecting these weapon upgrades he soon has the ability to shoot 3 at one time. Much like Grant, I thought he was on the weaker side when it came to attacking. His saving grace though is the ability to turn into a bat. These come at the cost of hearts. 1 second in his bat form counts for 1 heart. This makes some sections an absolute joke, giving you the chance to skip large portions of some stages. With each character's own unique abilities, you can reach certain sections of stages that others can't, so it's a bit trial and error and you'll need a few playthroughs to see what's fully in every stage. Now I know this inclusion of multiple characters is heavily praised, but for me personally it didn't do much. And by no means taking anything away from the game. As a whole, it's a solid classic, but when it comes to Castlevania titles, and most games to be honest, I just prefer playing as the one protagonist. Not to say I completely hate the idea, there was some sections where I hit a brick wall while playing as Trevor and then would swap to whatever character I had and found out they made a certain section a bit easier. I like how we are given a choice whether we want to use said characters or not. Like I said, I prefer the one protagonist, but I did do multiple playthroughs with each character for the sake of the video. One thing I did like about how you meet said characters is how you find them, so let's get into that. So the first game was completely linear while the second game took a non-linear approach. I like the idea of a non-linear game with Simon's Quest, but I think it was a bit too far ahead of its time and the execution wasn't that great. This game takes a little from the 2 previous games. Plays like the original, but there are multiple paths you can take on your travels. This is pulled off brilliantly in this, giving the game a whole load of replayability to it. This is how you meet the other side characters in the game depending on what path you take. This in a way is the game's difficulty setting, but doesn't make it too obvious to you. Each path definitely determines how difficult you want to make it for yourself. I've done a playthrough on Sypha and Grant's paths, but Alucard's I found to be extremely difficult. Like levels of frustration I haven't felt in a video game for a long time. Like I said, I prefer to use the one protagonist, and I like how we are given a choice whether to use them or not, but Alucard's path was the one path I found Trevor to be absolutely useless in. I feel as if some of the enemies you encounter on his path are fully designed to be used with Alucard in mind. These bone dragons are a nightmare with Trevor, but with Alucard, he makes light work of them. So yeah, the multiple paths are great and a good excuse to replay the game once completed. Also, just seeing what each level is like was enough incentive for me to do so because the game looks lovely. Each stage has its own unique feel and atmosphere, which made me look forward to what stages look like further on in the game while I was playing. There is definitely an upgrade when it came to the graphics, with certain stages having a certain kind of depth to them which the previous games didn't. I feel like this game really pushes the hardware for the NES. Mind you, it was only a year after this game's release in Japan that the well-loved Super Nintendo would be released. There's a load of new stage designs for the series here. We see the inclusion of vertical scrolling levels, set pieces like dodging blocks that fall from the sky to create a path leading upwards, new environmental hazards like jumping from one moving platform to another moving platform, a few here that would reappear in future Castlevania games. Continuing on with the enemies, there's a lot from the previous games, but we have some new ones too. I was pleasantly surprised to see some enemies from Super Castlevania IV, which I thought that's where they made their debut, but I was wrong. These are the Mudmen, Fishmen and Frogs, all great additions to the game. You'll find them all in the correct settings also, so they never really look out of place in the different environments you find yourself in. Much like everything else in this game, the boss fights have been ramped up big time also. There are 12 bosses in this game. At the earlier stages in the game they are fairly easy to take care of, but naturally the more you progress the more difficult they become. They throw in multiple bosses one after another in some stages. Hopefully by the next time you encounter them though you have memorised their pattern. One boss that completely threw me off guard though was the Bone Dragon King. I could tell by the time he disappeared that I didn't fully drain his health. I thought it was maybe a glitch, but my draw dropped once he reappeared again after I'd made further progress in that level. The two-headed dragon really gave me a lot of bother on my first run, but like most games, once you get the pattern down you'll feel a lot more at ease. The final encounter with Dracula is fantastic in this. In fact, the whole journey getting to him is great. You make your way through some parts taken right from the original Castlevania game before meeting him. He has 3 forms that you must deal with: his regular look, a floating head, then a massive beast that shoots projectiles. This kicked my arse for a while, but see, as soon as I defeated him I just felt a sigh of relief while watching those credits roll as I sat reflecting on my experience getting to the end. The bosses do really give you a run for your money in this, so you better be prepared if this is your first outing with this game. I guess that's maybe why the game allows for a feature that can give you extra lives. Simply type help me in the name select menu and you'll start with 10 lives rather than 2. A password for extra lives is great, but one thing I could have benefited from personally was more added time. This was actually my first experience with a Castlevania game where I felt as if I was against the clock. I faced so many bosses where the timer either reached 0 resulting in me dying or just narrowly defeating them in time. Never seen time as an obstacle in the first game, but here was a different story. I don't know if I was playing too tactically or what, but it's definitely something you best keep your eye on. Right, I've always said that the soundtrack for Super Castlevania IV is some of the best music I've ever heard in a video game, but I was not expecting the music in this to be as good as it was. We are straight back to the roots with this one, with all stages having their own unique feel compared to the previous game that used the same song a lot for the same environments. I can honestly say I don't think there is a bad tune in this, which I hope you have been able to hear throughout this video with the backing music I've used from it. Then it hit me big time once I started doing a bit of research for this and heard that people actually dislike the soundtrack. Not the soundtrack as a whole though, just the ones released for the North American and PAL region, which had me intrigued. So I searched up the Japanese OST and holy hell, did they get the better end of the bargain or what? All is musically the same, but the original Japanese version contained a specialised sound chip, the Konami VRCVI. This chip added an extra 2 square waves and a sawtooth wave, which if you don't know what that means, let me show you. Here's a few of my favourite songs from this game and just hear the difference. Hopefully you'll be as gobsmacked as I was. First will be the North American and PAL version, and second will be Japanese. They just sound a lot more beefier with the added bass. I did play the PAL version of the game for the video, but hearing the difference in the sound alone for the game's music was enough for me to find a copy of the Japanese version just to experience this all again with a much better sounding original soundtrack. Like I said, if you enjoyed the first game then you'll definitely love this. I'd describe it as Castlevania 1 but on gear, dialed all the way up. All the new features like separate paths you can take, giving the game a whole load of replayability value, multiple characters to use, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of it, although they definitely had their uses for certain sections in the game. New set pieces like vertical scrolling levels, new enemy types, harder bosses with some even having 2 parts to the fight. The music is absolutely phenomenal too. It really is just the total package when it comes to Castlevania on the NES. Next up is the Castlevania games on the Game Boy, so stay tuned for that. As always, if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to be kept up to date with future content. Also, if you liked the video then please do so. If not, hit dislike. Either way it lets me know what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya!